Deep in the hollows of Appalachia, where the morning mist clings to ridge lines like forgotten prayers, there exists a story that local historians refuse to document. A tale so disturbing that when researchers attempt to investigate, they find themselves inexplicably turning back, their equipment failing, their notes mysteriously vanishing from locked filing cabinets. This isn't about the usual mountain folklore, not the legends of phantom hitchhikers or haunted coal mines that tourists love to hear around campfires. This is about something far more real, far more recent, and infinitely more terrifying. The Appalachian family nobody dares to mention isn't just a single bloodline. It's a network of interconnected clans whose practices have remained hidden for over 2 centuries, protected by a combination of geographical isolation and something far more sinister. What I'm about to reveal comes from sources who spoke only on condition of anonymity, from documents that officially don't exist, and from testimonies given by people who disappeared shortly after providing them. Before we dive into the depths of this investigation, let me establish something crucial. I've spent the last 18 months researching this story, traveling to locations that don't appear on any map, speaking with individuals whose very existence seems to challenge what we think we know about modern America. The evidence I've gathered isn't just circumstantial, it's overwhelming, terrifying, and absolutely undeniable. By the end of this series, you'll understand why certain government agencies have worked so hard to keep this information buried, and why the few journalists who've attempted to expose this truth have either recanted their stories or simply vanished. The story begins in 1823 with the arrival of the Cordwer family in what would later become the most remote section of the Kentucky-Tennessee border. Unlike other settlers who sought fertile valleys or river access, the Cordwainers deliberately chose the most inaccessible terrain possible, a series of interconnected hollows so deep and narrow that sunlight barely penetrates the canopy, even at midday. Local Cherokee warned other settlers to avoid the area, claiming the land itself was cursed, but the Cordwainers seemed drawn to its isolation like moths to flame. What made the Cordwainers different wasn't immediately apparent to their neighbors. They appeared to be a typical frontier family, hardworking, self-sufficient, and deeply religious. They built their cabins with expert craftsmanship, cultivated small but productive gardens, and occasionally emerged from their hollow to trade high-quality goods for supplies they couldn't produce themselves. Their children were well-behaved, their women modest, their men respectful. To outside observers, they seemed like model citizens of the expanding frontier. But beneath this carefully maintained facade, the Cordwainers were practicing something that would have horrified their contemporaries, something that continues to horrify those who discover it today. The family maintained detailed records of their activities, written in a cipher that wasn't decoded until 1987 by a cryptographer working for the National Security Agency. When those records were finally translated, they revealed a systematic approach to human experimentation that predated the most notorious medical horrors of the 20th century by nearly 100 years. The Cordwainers believed that human consciousness could be transferred, modified, and preserved through specific ritualistic procedures. They weren't content with simple folk magic or traditional healing practices. Instead, they developed increasingly sophisticated methods for what they called soul crafting, the deliberate manipulation of human awareness and memory. Their early experiments involved willing family members, but as their techniques became more refined, they began targeting outsiders who ventured too close to their territory. The family's isolation wasn't accidental, it was essential to their work. The hollow they chose contained a unique geological formation, a series of limestone caves with acoustics so perfect that sounds could be amplified and directed with incredible precision. The Cordwainers discovered that certain combinations of tones, when produced in these chambers, could induce altered states of consciousness in human subjects. They spent decades mapping these acoustic properties, creating what amounted to a primitive but devastatingly effective form of psychological manipulation. By 1847, the Cordwainers had perfected their techniques to the point where they could completely rewrite a person's memories and personality within a matter of days. Their victims would emerge from the caves as completely different people with new identities, new loyalties, and absolutely no memory of their previous lives. These transformed individuals would then be sent back into the broader community, where they would serve as the family's eyes and ears, reporting back on potential threats or opportunities. The scope of their operation was staggering. Census records from the period show inexplicable population fluctuations in surrounding counties, people appearing and disappearing without explanation, entire families relocating overnight, and a disturbing number of individuals who claimed to have no memory of their past. Local law enforcement, such as it was, seemed powerless to investigate these anomalies. In fact, a careful examination of historical records suggests that several key officials may have been among the Cordwainers' victims. What makes this story particularly chilling is that the Cordwainers didn't work alone. Through their network of transformed individuals, they made contact with other isolated families who shared their interests in human experimentation. By the 1860s, they had established a loose confederation of clans scattered throughout the Appalachian region, each specializing in different aspects of what they called the Great Work. The Henderson family, located in the remote mountains of West Virginia, focused on physical transformation. They developed techniques for surgically altering human anatomy in ways that were both functional and horrifying. Their victims would emerge with enhanced senses, modified skeletal structures, and in some cases, additional organs that served purposes that remain unclear even today. The few photographs that survive from their compound show individuals whose appearance defied conventional human anatomy. The Blackwood clan, established in the deepest hollows of eastern Tennessee, specialized in what they termed temporal manipulation. They claimed to have discovered methods for extending human lifespan far beyond natural limits, though the price of these extensions was so grotesque that even other families in the Confederation refused to document their techniques. Witnesses who escaped from Blackwood territory described encountering individuals who claimed to be centuries old, their bodies preserved through processes that seemed to violate every known law of biology. The Thorne family, operating from a series of abandoned mine shafts in southwestern Virginia, developed the most sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques of any group in the Confederation. They could implant false memories with such precision that their victims would swear to experiences that never occurred, relationships that never existed, and skills they had never learned. The Thorns' victims often became unwitting agents, carrying out complex missions while believing they were acting on their own initiative. Each family maintained the same careful facade of normalcy that had served the Cordwainers so well. They participated in local communities, attended church services, and maintained trade relationships with their neighbors. But beneath this veneer of respectability, they were conducting experiments that pushed the boundaries of human knowledge and human decency in ways that still shock researchers today. The Confederation's activities might have continued indefinitely if not for the American Civil War. The conflict brought unprecedented scrutiny to previously isolated regions, as both Union and Confederate forces sought to control strategic mountain passes and exploit natural resources. Military units began encountering evidence of the family's activities, abandoned laboratories, mass graves, and survivors whose testimony painted a picture of systematic horror. Initially, these reports were dismissed as war hysteria or enemy propaganda. But as similar accounts emerged from multiple sources across the region, military investigators began to take notice. A classified report filed by Union Colonel James Morrison in 1863 detailed his unit's discovery of what he described as a facility for the systematic modification of human beings, operated by persons unknown for purposes that defy rational explanation. Morrison's report, which remained classified until 1973, described chambers lined with human skulls, surgical instruments of unknown design, and cells containing individuals in various stages of physical and psychological transformation. His men found detailed records documenting hundreds of procedures written in multiple languages and dialects, some of which linguistic experts still haven't identified. Most disturbing were the photographs, images that Morrison described as so profoundly disturbing that I have ordered them sealed and recommend they never be viewed by civilian personnel. The military's response was swift and decisive. Rather than attempt to arrest or prosecute the families involved, they implemented what was classified as Protocol 7, a systematic campaign to destroy all evidence of the Confederation's activities and relocate the families to secure facilities where their knowledge could be contained and studied. The operation, conducted between 1864 and 1866, involved multiple military units, specialized medical personnel, and what would later become the predecessor agencies to the CIA. But Protocol 7 wasn't entirely successful. Several families, including the original Cordwainers, managed to escape the military dragnet. They scattered throughout the Appalachian region, taking their knowledge and techniques with them. Some established new compounds in even more remote locations, while others integrated into existing communities, hiding their true nature behind carefully constructed identities. The failure of Protocol 7 had consequences that continue to reverberate today. The escaped families didn't abandon their work, they simply became more careful about concealing it. They developed new methods for avoiding detection, created more sophisticated cover stories, and established networks of protection that extend far beyond the mountains where they originated. Government agencies have been tracking these families ever since, but their efforts have been hampered by the very techniques the families developed. How do you investigate people who can rewrite memories, alter physical appearances, and maintain false identities for decades? How do you build a case against individuals who may not even be who they claim to be? The answer, as we'll explore in the next part of this investigation, is that you don't. Instead, you work to contain the threat, limit the damage, and hope that the general public never discovers the truth about what's been hiding in the mountains all along. The modern era brought new challenges for these hidden families, but also unprecedented opportunities. As America industrialized and urbanized, the remote hollows of Appalachia became even more isolated, creating perfect conditions for their continued operations. The families adapted their techniques to exploit new technologies and social structures, developing methods that would have been impossible in earlier centuries. The Cordwainers, who had survived the Civil War purge, established themselves in a series of interconnected compounds throughout eastern Kentucky. By the 1920s, they had perfected what they called generational conditioning, a process where children born into their network would undergo systematic psychological modification from birth. These children would grow up with carefully implanted memories, specialized training, and absolute loyalty to the family's cause. Well, most disturbing of all, they would believe their modified existence was completely normal. Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychiatrist who worked with federal agencies investigating these families, described the process in a classified report dated 1981. Her words, obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, paint a chilling picture of systematic child abuse disguised as education. The subjects display a level of psychological conditioning that exceeds anything we've observed in military or intelligence applications. She wrote, "They possess memories of childhoods that never occurred, skills that were implanted rather than learned, and emotional responses that have been deliberately engineered. Most troubling is their apparent contentment with their situation. They genuinely believe they are living normal, fulfilling lives." The family's ability to create these perfectly conditioned individuals gave them an enormous advantage in infiltrating mainstream society. Their agents could pass any background check, maintain deep cover identities for decades, and carry out complex operations while remaining completely undetected. Government investigators estimate that by the 1950s, the families had placed operatives in positions ranging from local law enforcement to federal agencies, from medical institutions to academic research centers. The scope of their infiltration became apparent only gradually as investigators began noticing patterns in seemingly unrelated incidents. Missing persons cases that were never properly investigated, research projects that were mysteriously defunded or redirected, government officials who made inexplicable policy decisions that benefited the family's interests. The cumulative effect was a network of protection and influence that made traditional law enforcement approaches virtually impossible. The family's techniques continued to evolve throughout the 20th century. The Cordwainers developed methods for inducing specific types of amnesia, allowing them to erase traumatic memories from their victims while leaving their general knowledge and skills intact. This breakthrough made it possible to transform unwilling subjects without the telltale signs of psychological trauma that had plagued their earlier work. The Henderson family, meanwhile, had perfected their physical modification techniques to the point where they could alter human anatomy with surgical precision. Their subjects would emerge with enhanced physical capabilities, improved vision, increased strength, modified skeletal structures, but the changes were subtle enough to avoid detection during routine medical examinations. Former federal investigator Robert Hayes, who spent 15 years tracking the Henderson operations, described their work as evolution through surgery, creating individuals who appear human but possess capabilities that border on the superhuman. The Blackwood Clan had made perhaps the most disturbing advances of all. Their experiments in life extension had progressed from crude attempts at preserving aging bodies to sophisticated processes that could halt and even reverse the aging process at the cellular level. Intelligence reports from the 1970s describe encounters with individuals claiming to be descendants of the original Blackwood family, but whose physical appearance suggested they were no older than 30 or 40 years of age. More troubling were the reports of Blackwood operatives who had been under surveillance for decades without showing any signs of aging. FBI agent Margaret Torres, who monitored suspected Blackwood activities from 1968 to 1995, filed reports describing the same individual appearing at family gatherings spanning nearly 3 decades, unchanged by the passage of time. Subject appears to be frozen at approximately age 35, she wrote in 1994. No signs of aging, no changes in physical appearance, no medical conditions typical of someone who should now be in their 70s. The Thorne family had developed the most sophisticated mind control techniques of any group in the Confederation. Their methods went far beyond simple hypnosis or psychological manipulation. They had discovered ways to implant complex behavioral programs that could lay dormant for years before being activated by specific triggers. Their subjects would live apparently normal lives until receiving a predetermined signal, a phrase, a sound, an image that would activate their programming and compel them to carry out predetermined actions. Federal investigators first became aware of these sleeper agents in the 1960s when a series of apparently random crimes were traced back to individuals with no previous history of violence or criminal behavior. The perpetrators would commit acts of sabotage, theft, or even murder, then return to their normal lives with no memory of their actions. Psychological evaluation revealed that these individuals had been programmed to carry out specific tasks, then automatically suppress all memory of their involvement. The implications were staggering. If the Thorne family could create sleeper agents who were unaware of their own programming, how many such individuals might be operating in mainstream society? How many people in positions of trust, teachers, doctors, police officers, government officials, might be unknowing agents of these hidden families? The question became more urgent as investigators began uncovering evidence of the family's long-term goals. Documents recovered from raided compounds revealed a systematic plan to influence American society at the highest levels. The families weren't content with simple survival or even local control. They had developed a multi-generational strategy for reshaping American culture, politics, and social structures according to their own twisted vision. The plan, which investigators codenamed Project Metamorphosis, involved the gradual placement of their agents in key positions throughout society. These operatives would work to promote policies and practices that would make the family's activities easier to conceal while gradually normalizing the techniques they had developed. The ultimate goal was a society where psychological manipulation, physical modification, and memory alteration would be accepted as normal parts of human existence. Evidence suggests The families had made significant progress toward these goals by the 1980s. The rise of cosmetic surgery, the acceptance of pharmaceutical mood modification, the normalization of surveillance and data collection, all of these social trends aligned perfectly with the family's interests. Whether these developments were the result of deliberate manipulation or simply fortunate coincidences remains a matter of ongoing investigation. The family's influence extended into the academic world as well. Researchers began noticing that certain universities seemed to attract an unusual number of faculty members with connections to the Appalachian region. These academics would often specialize in fields directly related to the family's interests: psychology, neuroscience, genetic engineering, social manipulation. Their research would be well funded and highly regarded, but the practical applications of their work would often disappear into classified government programs or private research facilities. Dr. Michael Reeves, a neuroscientist at a major university, became suspicious when he noticed that several of his colleagues shared similar backgrounds and research interests. His investigation revealed that at least 6 faculty members in his department had grown up in the same remote region of West Virginia, had attended the same small college, and had received their graduate training from the same advisor. When Reeves attempted to investigate further, he found that records of their early lives were curiously incomplete, and the college they claimed to have attended had no documentation of their enrollment. Reeves's concerns were dismissed by university administrators, who accused him of paranoid thinking and professional jealousy. But his suspicions were validated when federal investigators approached him in 1987, revealing that his colleagues were under surveillance as suspected agents of the families. The investigators asked for his cooperation in monitoring their activities, but warned him that his safety could not be guaranteed if his involvement became known. The conversation with federal agents opened Reeves's eyes to the true scope of the family's infiltration. He learned that similar patterns existed at universities across the country, with suspected agents occupying key positions in departments related to psychology, biology, and social sciences. These individuals were not just conducting research, they were shaping the direction of entire fields of study, influencing what questions were asked, what methods were used, and what conclusions were drawn. The implications for scientific integrity were profound. If the families could influence academic research at the highest levels, how much of what we thought we knew about human psychology and biology might be deliberately distorted? How many breakthrough discoveries might have been suppressed because they threatened the family's interests? How many promising lines of research might have been abandoned because they came too close to revealing the truth? These questions became even more urgent as investigators began uncovering evidence of the family's involvement in government research programs. Declassified documents revealed that suspected family members had been involved in some of the most controversial psychological experiments of the Cold War era. Their expertise in mind control and memory manipulation had made them valuable assets to intelligence agencies, even as those same agencies were supposedly working to contain their activities. The relationship between the families and government agencies was complex and often contradictory. On one hand, federal investigators were working to track down and neutralize the family's operations. On the other hand, Other government programs were actively recruiting family members for their unique skills and knowledge. This internal conflict created opportunities for the families to exploit, allowing them to maintain their independence while providing just enough cooperation to avoid serious persecution. The family's survival strategy was sophisticated and multifaceted. They maintained multiple identities, operated through layers of intermediaries, and constantly shifted their base of operations to avoid detection. Most importantly, they had learned to make themselves indispensable to the very agencies that were supposed to be hunting them. Their knowledge of human psychology and behavior modification was so advanced that government researchers found it impossible to replicate their techniques without their direct involvement. This symbiotic relationship created a situation where the families could continue their work under the protection of government classification. Their most disturbing experiments were conducted in secure facilities, funded by black budget programs, and justified as necessary for national security. The line between law enforcement and collaboration had become so blurred that it was often impossible to determine whether government agencies were investigating the families or working with them. The consequences of this relationship extended far beyond the immediate victims of the family's experiments. The techniques they developed were being refined and applied in ways that affected millions of Americans. The psychological manipulation methods pioneered in remote mountain hollows were being adapted for use in advertising, political campaigns, and social engineering programs. The memory modification techniques that had once been used to transform kidnapped victims were being studied for potential applications in treating trauma and mental illness. The transformation of these experimental techniques into mainstream applications represented a fundamental shift in how the families operated. No longer content with hiding in remote hollows, they had learned to disguise their work as legitimate scientific research and government programs. The most disturbing aspect wasn't just that their methods were being used on a larger scale, it was that they were being implemented by people who had no idea of their true origins. Dr. Patricia Vance, a former researcher at the National Institute of Mental Health, discovered this reality firsthand when she was recruited to work on what she believed was a breakthrough treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. The program, funded through a series of classified contracts, involved techniques for selectively modifying traumatic memories while leaving other cognitive functions intact. The methods were remarkably sophisticated, far beyond anything she had encountered in traditional psychological research. It wasn't until Vance began examining the theoretical foundation of the program that she realized the techniques bore an uncanny resemblance to procedures described in historical accounts of Appalachian folk practices. When she attempted to trace the origins of the methodology, she discovered that the primary research had been conducted by scientists whose backgrounds led back to the same remote mountain communities that had produced the original families. Vance's investigation revealed that the memory modification program wasn't an isolated case. Similar projects were being conducted at research institutions across the country, all utilizing techniques that could be traced back to the family's original work. The methods had been refined and modernized, but the fundamental principles remained unchanged. Government agencies were unknowingly funding the continuation of experiments that had begun in limestone caves nearly 2 centuries earlier. The scope of this hidden influence became apparent when Vance began connecting seemingly unrelated research programs. Studies on subliminal messaging, investigations into crowd psychology, experiments in behavioral modification all showed signs of techniques pioneered by the families. The academic papers describing these methods were written by researchers with impeccable credentials, published in prestigious journals, and cited by thousands of other scientists. But the underlying knowledge had been developed through procedures that would have been considered crimes against humanity if their true nature had been understood. The families had achieved something unprecedented in the history of human experimentation. They had managed to legitimize their work by embedding it so deeply in mainstream science that it became impossible to separate their contributions from legitimate research. Their techniques were being taught in universities, applied in hospitals, and used by government agencies around the world. The boundary between ethical research and the family's twisted experiments had been erased so completely that most practitioners had no idea they were continuing a tradition that originated in the darkest chapters of American history. This realization led to a crisis within the intelligence community. How could agencies protect national security while relying on techniques developed by the very people they were supposed to be investigating? How could they maintain the moral authority to condemn the family's activities while simultaneously benefiting from their research? The questions were so troubling that several high-ranking officials requested transfers rather than continue working with programs that had been compromised by the family's influence. The family's strategic patience had paid off beyond their wildest expectations. They no longer needed to hide their activities because they had successfully convinced mainstream society to adopt their methods voluntarily. The psychological manipulation techniques that had once been used to control kidnapped victims were now being employed by advertising agencies to influence consumer behavior. The memory modification procedures that had terrorized Civil War-era investigators were being refined for use in treating mental illness and trauma. The physical modification techniques developed by the Henderson family had found new applications in the rapidly advancing field of genetic engineering. Their understanding of human anatomy and surgical modification had contributed to breakthroughs in reconstructive surgery, organ transplantation, and prosthetic development. The same knowledge that had once been used to create barely human creatures was now being applied to help accident victims and wounded veterans. Even the life extension research conducted by the Blackwood clan had found mainstream applications. Their techniques for cellular regeneration and aging reversal had contributed to advances in longevity research, cancer treatment, and regenerative medicine. The methods they had developed to preserve their own unnatural lifespans were being studied by legitimate researchers who had no idea of their horrific origins. The families had achieved the ultimate camouflage. They had made their work indistinguishable from legitimate science. Their techniques were being used by people who would have been horrified to learn the true history of the methods they employed. The moral compromises that had once been forced upon desperate government agencies were now being made voluntarily by researchers who believed they were advancing human knowledge for the betterment of society. But the family's success in legitimizing their work had created new vulnerabilities. The same publicity that protected their techniques from scrutiny also made it impossible for them to maintain the secrecy that had once been their greatest protection. Their methods were being studied, analyzed, and documented by thousands of researchers who might eventually discover inconsistencies or traces of their true origins. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a forensic psychologist working with the FBI, began noticing these inconsistencies while reviewing case files from the 1990s. Several high-profile criminal cases had involved defendants who claimed to have no memory of their actions, despite overwhelming evidence of their guilt. The psychological evaluations of these individuals revealed patterns that didn't match any known forms of dissociative disorder or amnesia. Morrison's analysis revealed that all of these cases shared certain characteristics. The defendants had all spent time in remote areas of Appalachia in the months before their crimes. They had all exhibited behavioral changes that their families and friends had found inexplicable. Most significantly, they all showed signs of having undergone sophisticated psychological conditioning that was far beyond the capabilities of any known criminal organization. The implications were staggering. If the families were still actively creating programmed individuals, they had developed techniques that were virtually undetectable using standard psychological evaluation methods. These modern sleeper agents could be walking among us, living normal lives until receiving activation signals that would compel them to carry out predetermined actions. Morrison's investigation revealed that the programming techniques had evolved far beyond the crude methods used in earlier decades. Modern family agents could be programmed with multiple layers of instructions, complex behavioral patterns, and sophisticated cover stories that would fool even trained investigators. They could maintain their false identities for years or even decades, carrying out long-term missions that might not be activated until specific conditions were met. The discovery of these advanced programming techniques forced a fundamental reassessment of everything investigators thought they knew about the family's current capabilities. If they could create sleeper agents who were indistinguishable from normal citizens, how many such individuals might be operating in positions of trust throughout society? How many teachers, doctors, police officers, or government officials might be unknowing agents of these hidden families? The question became more urgent when Morrison began identifying patterns in the geographic distribution of these cases. The programmed individuals weren't randomly distributed across the country. They were concentrated in specific regions that corresponded to areas where the families had historical connections. This suggested that the families were still operating from their traditional bases of power, but had developed methods for projecting their influence far beyond their mountain strongholds. The realization that the families were still actively creating new agents led to the most intensive investigation in the history of federal law enforcement's efforts to combat their activities. Operation Appalachian Dawn, launched in 1995, involved multiple agencies working together to identify and neutralize the family's modern operations. The investigation would reveal that the families had not only survived into the modern era, but had adapted their techniques to exploit contemporary technology and social structures in ways that made their ancestors' activities seem primitive by comparison. The families had learned to use the internet, social media, and modern communication systems to coordinate their activities across vast distances. They had developed methods for identifying and recruiting new agents from online communities, using sophisticated psychological profiling to target individuals who would be susceptible to their conditioning techniques. Most disturbing of all, they had begun using modern medical technology to enhance their traditional methods, creating hybrid approaches that combined ancient knowledge with cutting-edge science. The investigation revealed that the families had established a network of seemingly legitimate medical clinics, research facilities, and educational institutions throughout the Appalachian region. These front organizations provided cover for their continued experiments while also serving as recruitment centers for new agents. Patients seeking treatment for mental health issues, students pursuing advanced degrees, and researchers looking for funding opportunities were all potential targets for the family's sophisticated recruitment and conditioning programs. The scope of their modern operations was breathtaking. Intelligence analysts estimated that the families had direct or indirect influence over dozens of organizations, hundreds of businesses, and thousands of individuals scattered across multiple states. Their network had grown from a handful of isolated mountain families into a sophisticated criminal organization that operated on a scale comparable to international terrorist groups or drug cartels. But unlike traditional criminal organizations, the families had learned to operate entirely within the boundaries of legal and social acceptability. Their front organizations were legitimate businesses that provided real services to their communities. Their research facilities produced genuine scientific breakthroughs that advanced human knowledge. Their educational institutions graduated students who went on to successful careers in various fields. The families had perfected the art of hiding in plain sight, conducting their most disturbing activities under the cover of respectable institutions. The challenge for law enforcement was unprecedented. How do you investigate organizations that appear to be legitimate? How do you build criminal cases against people whose activities are indistinguishable from normal business operations? How do you protect potential victims when you can't identify who they are or predict when they might be targeted? The families had created a situation where traditional law enforcement approaches were virtually useless. Their activities were so well integrated into mainstream society that attempting to shut them down would have required dismantling entire sectors of the economy and academic research. The cure would have been worse than the disease, potentially destroying legitimate institutions and research programs that had no connection to the family's criminal activities. This reality forced investigators to develop new strategies for combating the family's influence. Rather than attempting to destroy their network directly, agencies began focusing on identifying and neutralizing their most dangerous activities while allowing their legitimate operations to continue. The goal was to contain the threat while avoiding the collateral damage that would result from a full-scale assault on their infrastructure. The strategy required unprecedented cooperation between multiple agencies, each contributing specialized expertise to the investigation. The FBI provided criminal investigation capabilities, the CIA contributed intelligence analysis, the NSA offered electronic surveillance resources, and various military agencies provided technical support. The operation represented the largest domestic intelligence effort in American history, involving thousands of personnel and consuming hundreds of millions of dollars in resources. But despite the massive investment of resources and personnel, Operation Appalachian Dawn faced challenges that seemed almost insurmountable. The families had spent 2 centuries perfecting their methods of concealment and misdirection. They had learned to anticipate law enforcement tactics and develop countermeasures that neutralized traditional investigative techniques. Most importantly, they had achieved a level of integration with mainstream society that made it impossible to attack them without causing significant harm to innocent people and legitimate institutions. The operation's greatest success came not from direct confrontation with the families, but from developing methods for protecting potential victims and limiting the damage caused by their activities. Investigators created early warning systems that could identify individuals who might be targeted for recruitment or conditioning. They developed techniques for detecting and neutralizing programmed agents before they could carry out their missions. Most importantly, they established protocols for containing information about the family's activities to prevent panic or vigilante actions that might make the situation worse. The family's response to increased scrutiny was characteristically sophisticated. Rather than escalating their activities or attempting to directly confront law enforcement, they began a strategic withdrawal from their most exposed operations. Front organizations were quietly dissolved, research programs were transferred to new institutions, and key personnel were relocated to positions where they would be less likely to attract attention. The families demonstrated once again their remarkable ability to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining their core capabilities. This strategic withdrawal created new challenges for investigators. As the family's operations became more diffuse and harder to track, it became increasingly difficult to assess the scope of their activities or predict their future actions. The concentration of their operations in specific geographic areas had made them easier to monitor, but their new distributed approach made them nearly impossible to track using traditional surveillance methods. The investigation revealed that the families had developed contingency plans for exactly this type of scenario. They had created multiple layers of backup operations, alternative command structures, and emergency protocols that allowed them to maintain their activities even under intense scrutiny. Their organizational structure was so resilient that eliminating any single component would have minimal impact on their overall capabilities. The realization that the families could not be eliminated through traditional law enforcement methods led to a fundamental shift in how government agencies approached the problem. Rather than viewing them as a criminal organization that could be dismantled, investigators began treating them as a permanent threat that would require ongoing management and containment. The goal shifted from elimination to mitigation, focusing on limiting their most harmful activities, while accepting that some level of their operations would likely continue indefinitely. This acceptance of the family's permanence represented a profound admission of the limits of government power. Despite having access to the most advanced investigative techniques and unlimited resources, federal agencies had been unable to eliminate a threat that had originated in the remote mountains of 19th century America. The families had demonstrated that with sufficient patience, sophistication, and adaptability, even a small group of determined individuals could maintain their independence against the full power of the modern state. The implications of this realization extended far beyond the specific case of the Appalachian families. If these mountain clans could successfully resist government efforts to eliminate them, what did that say about the state's ability to deal with other unconventional threats? How many other groups might be operating with similar levels of sophistication and concealment? The families had proven that it was possible to maintain a hidden existence in modern America, raising troubling questions about what other secrets might be lurking in the shadows of contemporary society. The most disturbing aspect of the family's evolution wasn't their resilience against government pressure. It was their apparent shift toward a more aggressive expansion strategy. Intelligence reports from the late 1990s began documenting a phenomenon that investigators initially dismissed as coincidence: the simultaneous appearance of new family operations in major metropolitan areas across the United States. These weren't the traditional rural compounds that had characterized their historical presence. Instead, they were establishing sophisticated urban networks that operated through chains of medical clinics, research laboratories, and educational facilities. Dr. James Patterson, a psychiatrist who had been treating patients exhibiting unusual memory disorders, first noticed the pattern when reviewing case files from his practice in Chicago. Over the course of 18 months, he had encountered 17 individuals who claimed to have grown up in small Appalachian communities, but whose childhood memories contained impossible details, references to technologies that didn't exist during their supposed youth, knowledge of events that occurred decades before their birth, and emotional attachments to people who had no record of existing. Patterson's initial assumption was that these patients were suffering from some form of dissociative disorder, possibly related to childhood trauma. But as he delved deeper into their backgrounds, he discovered that all 17 individuals shared certain characteristics that defied conventional explanation. They had all relocated to Chicago within the same 6-month period. They had all found employment in fields related to psychology, medicine, or social services. Most significantly, they all possessed skills and knowledge that far exceeded what their educational backgrounds should have provided. When Patterson attempted to verify their academic credentials, he encountered a web of documentation that seemed designed to obscure rather than illuminate their true histories. The colleges they claimed to have attended confirmed their enrollment, but the records were curiously sparse, lacking the detailed documentation that would normally accompany legitimate academic careers. Their professional references checked out, but the individuals providing those references often seemed vague about specific details of their working relationships. The pattern became even more troubling when Patterson discovered that similar cases were being reported by colleagues in other major cities. Psychiatrists in New York, Los Angeles, Houston, and Atlanta were all encountering patients with identical symptom profiles and suspicious backgrounds. The geographic distribution wasn't random. The families appeared to be targeting specific metropolitan areas for reasons that remained unclear. Federal investigators who had been monitoring the family's activities for decades recognized the significance of this urban expansion. The families had never before attempted to establish operations in major population centers, preferring the isolation and obscurity of rural areas. Their decision to move into cities represented a fundamental shift in strategy that suggested they were preparing for some kind of large-scale operation. The investigation into the family's urban network revealed an organizational structure that was far more sophisticated than anything they had previously demonstrated. Rather than operating as isolated family units, they had created a hierarchical system that allowed for coordinated activities across multiple cities. Communication between cells was maintained through encrypted channels that utilized cutting-edge technology, while operational security was enforced through psychological conditioning that made traditional interrogation techniques virtually useless. The family's urban agents were recruited through a process that was both more subtle and more comprehensive than their historical methods. Instead of kidnapping victims for immediate transformation, they were identifying individuals who were already psychologically vulnerable and gradually drawing them into their network through seemingly legitimate relationships. The process could take months or even years, with the target being slowly conditioned to accept increasingly unusual beliefs and behaviors. Dr. Sarah Williams, a social worker who had unknowingly been targeted for recruitment, provided investigators with detailed information about the family's modern conditioning techniques after managing to escape their influence. Her account revealed a systematic approach that combined traditional psychological manipulation with sophisticated technological enhancement. The families had learned to use social media monitoring, data analytics, and behavioral psychology to identify potential recruits and tailor their approach to each individual's specific vulnerabilities. Williams described how her recruitment began with what appeared to be a chance encounter at a professional conference. A colleague introduced her to a charismatic researcher who claimed to be developing revolutionary new approaches to trauma therapy. The researcher, who called himself Dr. Marcus Thornfield, invited her to participate in a pilot program that promised to help victims of childhood abuse recover memories that had been suppressed through psychological trauma. The program began with seemingly legitimate therapeutic sessions conducted in a well-appointed office in downtown Chicago. Dr. Thornfield used a combination of hypnosis, guided imagery, and pharmaceutical enhancement to help Williams access what he claimed were repressed memories of her childhood. The sessions were recorded for research purposes, and Williams was told that her participation was contributing to groundbreaking advances in psychological treatment. Over the course of several months, the sessions became increasingly intense and intrusive. Williams found herself experiencing vivid memories of events that she had no previous recollection of, childhood experiences that seemed completely foreign to her actual history. Dr. Thornfield explained that these recovered memories were evidence of traumatic experiences that her mind had blocked out for self-protection. He assured her that the process of recovering these memories was essential for her psychological healing. The memories themselves were disturbing and disorienting. Williams began recalling a childhood spent in a remote mountain community where she had been subjected to strange rituals and bizarre educational practices. She remembered being taught skills that seemed impossible for a child to master: complex mathematical concepts, advanced scientific principles, and sophisticated psychological techniques. Most disturbing were the memories of participating in ceremonies that involved other children and adults engaging in activities that seemed to blur the line between education and indoctrination. As the sessions continued, Williams began experiencing changes in her personality and behavior that extended far beyond the therapeutic setting. She found herself possessing knowledge and skills that she had no memory of learning. She could perform complex calculations in her head, speak languages she had never studied, and demonstrate an intuitive understanding of human psychology that far exceeded her professional training. These abilities would emerge spontaneously, often surprising her as much as those around her. Dr. Thornfield explained these changes as evidence of her expanding consciousness and recovering potential that had been suppressed by childhood trauma. He introduced her to other participants in the program, individuals who had undergone similar transformations and who formed a close-knit community centered around their shared experiences. The group met regularly for what Thornfield called integration sessions, where participants would share their recovered memories and practice the skills they had developed. The community aspect of the program was particularly effective in maintaining participants' commitment to the process. Williams found herself forming deep emotional bonds with other members of the group, relationships that seemed to transcend normal friendship and approach something resembling family loyalty. The shared experience of memory recovery created a sense of special knowledge and purpose that made the outside world seem increasingly irrelevant and distant. It was only when Williams began experiencing gaps in her memory, periods where she would find herself in unfamiliar locations with no recollection of how she had gotten there, that she began to question the legitimacy of the program. These episodes were initially dismissed by Dr. Thornfield as temporary side effects of the memory recovery process, but they became increasingly frequent and disturbing. Williams would lose hours or even days, returning to awareness in strange places with evidence of having engaged in activities she couldn't remember. The turning point came when Williams discovered photographs on her phone showing her participating in what appeared to be a medical procedure on an unconscious patient. The images were taken in a clinical setting she didn't recognize, and she was shown working alongside individuals she had never seen before. When she confronted Dr. Thornfield about the photographs, he claimed they were evidence of false memories created by her psychological resistance to the therapeutic process. Williams's growing suspicion led her to conduct her own investigation into Dr. Thornfield's background and credentials. What she discovered was a carefully constructed identity that had no basis in reality. The medical school he claimed to have attended had no record of his enrollment. The research publications he cited as evidence of his expertise were published in journals that didn't exist. Most disturbing of all, the office where their sessions took place was registered to a shell company that had connections to organizations throughout the Appalachian region. The realization that she had been systematically deceived and manipulated triggered a psychological crisis that nearly resulted in her complete mental breakdown. Williams found herself unable to distinguish between her real memories and the false ones that had been implanted during the therapeutic sessions. She couldn't trust her own thoughts or perceptions, and she began experiencing paranoid delusions that everyone around her was part of the conspiracy that had entrapped her. Williams's escape from the family's influence was facilitated by a federal agent who had been monitoring Dr. Thornfield's activities as part of Operation Appalachian Dawn. Agent Rebecca Martinez had been posing as a potential recruit, allowing herself to be drawn into the early stages of the conditioning process in order to gather intelligence about the family's urban operations. When she recognized that Williams was experiencing a psychological crisis that could expose the investigation, she broke her cover to extract both of them from the program. The debriefing process revealed the true scope of the family's urban expansion. Williams's case was one of dozens being conducted simultaneously across multiple cities, each targeting individuals in specific professions that would provide the families with strategic advantages. Social workers, medical professionals, teachers, and law enforcement officers were all being systematically recruited and conditioned to serve as unwitting agents of the family's broader agenda. The family's urban operations represented a fundamental evolution in their approach to societal influence. Rather than attempting to control society from the margins, they were embedding themselves directly into the institutions and professions that shaped public policy and social behavior. Their agents were being positioned to influence everything from child protective services to mental health treatment, from educational curricula to law enforcement practices. The sophistication of their recruitment and conditioning techniques had reached levels that challenged investigators' understanding of human psychology. The families had developed methods for implanting false memories with such precision that even trained psychologists couldn't distinguish them from genuine recollections. They could modify personality structures in ways that appeared to be natural psychological development rather than artificial manipulation. Most disturbing of all, they could create programmed behaviors that would remain dormant for years before being activated by specific triggers. The investigation revealed that the families had been refining these techniques through decades of experimentation on unwilling subjects. Government facilities that had been used to study captured family members during the Cold War had inadvertently provided them with access to cutting-edge research in neuroscience and behavioral psychology. The families had learned to combine their traditional methods with modern scientific understanding, creating hybrid approaches that were far more effective than either approach alone. Dr. Patricia Vance, who had previously discovered the family's influence in government research programs, was recruited to help develop countermeasures for their advanced conditioning techniques. Her work revealed that the families had achieved breakthroughs in memory manipulation that were decades ahead of mainstream scientific understanding. They had learned to target specific neural pathways associated with memory formation and recall, allowing them to implant false memories while leaving other cognitive functions intact. The family's understanding of human psychology had evolved to the point where they could predict and manipulate individual behavior with remarkable accuracy. They had developed sophisticated profiling techniques that allowed them to identify the specific psychological vulnerabilities that would make someone susceptible to their conditioning. More troubling still, they had learned to use these same techniques to identify individuals who would be naturally resistant to their influence, allowing them to either avoid such people or develop specialized approaches for overcoming their resistance. The urban expansion represented more than just a change in the family's geographic distribution. It reflected a fundamental shift in their long-term objectives. Intelligence analysts concluded that the families were no longer content with simply maintaining their traditional way of life in isolated mountain communities. They were actively working to transform American society according to their own vision, using their network of conditioned agents to gradually reshape social institutions and cultural norms. The scope of their ambitions became apparent when investigators began analyzing the specific professions and institutions that the families were targeting. They weren't randomly recruiting agents from various sectors of society. They were systematically infiltrating the systems that controlled information flow, social services, and public policy. Their agents were being positioned to influence what Americans learned in schools, how they received medical treatment, and how they were protected by law enforcement. The family's approach to societal transformation was characteristically patient and methodical. Rather than attempting dramatic changes that might attract attention, they were implementing gradual modifications that would appear to be natural social evolution. Their agents would promote policies and practices that aligned with the family's interests while maintaining the appearance of legitimate professional judgment. The cumulative effect would be a society that gradually adopted the family's values and methods without realizing what was happening. The investigation revealed that this process was already well underway in several major metropolitan areas. Educational policies were being modified to include psychological techniques that bore suspicious resemblances to the family's conditioning methods. Medical treatment protocols were being updated to incorporate memory modification procedures that had been developed through the family's research. Law enforcement training programs were being revised to include behavioral control techniques that could be used to suppress dissent and maintain social order. The family's influence on educational systems was particularly concerning. Their agents in school administrations were promoting curricula that emphasized psychological manipulation techniques disguised as social emotional learning. Students were being taught to identify and modify their own thought patterns, supposedly to improve their academic performance and social adjustment. But the techniques being taught were remarkably similar to the self-conditioning methods that the families used to maintain loyalty among their own members. The medical infiltration was even more disturbing. Family agents in hospitals and clinics were implementing treatment protocols that incorporated memory modification techniques originally developed for their own victims. Patients seeking treatment for trauma, depression, or anxiety were being subjected to procedures that could potentially alter their memories and personality structures. The treatments were presented as cutting-edge therapeutic approaches, but they were actually refined versions of the same techniques the families had been using for decades. The law enforcement infiltration posed perhaps the greatest threat to public safety. Family agents in police departments were promoting training programs that emphasized psychological control techniques over traditional law enforcement methods. Officers were being taught to use manipulation and coercion rather than physical force to maintain order. While this might seem like an improvement over violent policing methods, the techniques being taught were designed to create compliance rather than justice, suppressing dissent rather than protecting rights. The family's systematic infiltration of these key institutions represented a level of social engineering that was unprecedented in American history. They had learned to use the democratic process itself as a tool for implementing their agenda, working through legitimate channels to achieve changes that would have been impossible through direct action. Their agents could promote policies and practices that served the family's interests while maintaining the appearance of serving the public good. The challenge for investigators was developing strategies to counter this infiltration without destroying the institutions themselves. The families had embedded their agents so deeply into legitimate organizations that attempting to remove them would have caused massive disruption to essential services. Schools would lose key administrators, hospitals would lose experienced medical staff, and police departments would lose trained officers. The cure would have been worse than the disease. The solution required a more subtle approach that focused on identifying and neutralizing the family's agents without exposing the broader investigation. Federal agencies developed techniques for detecting the psychological conditioning that marked family agents, allowing them to identify compromised individuals without alerting the families to their surveillance. Once identified, these agents could be monitored and their activities limited without removing them from their positions. The monitoring process revealed the true sophistication of the family's urban operations. Their agents weren't just following simple programmed instructions. They were operating with considerable autonomy and creativity within broad strategic guidelines. They could adapt their methods to changing circumstances, develop new approaches to achieving their objectives, and even recruit additional agents without direct supervision from their handlers. This level of operational sophistication suggested that the families had developed training and conditioning techniques that were far more advanced than traditional brainwashing or mind control methods. Their agents retained their individual personalities and cognitive abilities while being motivated by an unshakable commitment to the family's cause. They could pass psychological evaluations, maintain normal social relationships, and perform complex professional duties while secretly working to advance the family's agenda. The investigation revealed that the families had achieved this level of control through a combination of techniques that attacked multiple aspects of human psychology simultaneously. They used memory modification to create false histories that justified loyalty to the family cause. They employed behavioral conditioning to create automatic responses to specific situations. They utilized social engineering to create environments where their agents would naturally gravitate toward positions of influence and authority. Most disturbing of all, the families had learned to exploit the basic human need for belonging and purpose. Their agents genuinely believed that they were working to improve society and help their fellow human beings. The families had convinced them that their methods, however extreme, were necessary to achieve important social goals. This psychological framework made their agents nearly impossible to deprogram, as they would resist any attempt to challenge their beliefs as an attack on their most fundamental values. The family's success in creating true believers rather than simple puppets represented a quantum leap in their capabilities. Traditional mind control techniques produced agents who were obviously compromised and could be identified through careful observation. But the family's modern agents were indistinguishable from normal, highly motivated professionals who simply happened to share a particular philosophical outlook. They could advocate for policies and practices that served the family's interests while genuinely believing they were acting in the public good. This psychological sophistication extended to the family's recruitment strategies as well. They had learned to identify individuals who were already predisposed to accept their worldview, making the conditioning process much more efficient and effective. Rather than attempting to force unwilling subjects to adopt alien beliefs, they were finding people whose existing psychological makeup made them natural candidates for their cause. The recruitment process typically began with what appeared to be legitimate professional networking or educational opportunities. Potential agents would be invited to conferences, training programs, or research projects that seemed to offer career advancement or intellectual stimulation. The family's representatives would present themselves as respected professionals, offering valuable opportunities for personal and professional growth. The conditioning process was so gradual and subtle that most subjects never realized they were being manipulated. The families had learned to present their ideas in ways that seemed to be natural extensions of mainstream professional knowledge and practice. They would introduce increasingly radical concepts by framing them as logical developments of accepted principles, making it difficult for subjects to identify the point at which they had crossed the line from legitimate professional development to ideological indoctrination. The family's understanding of human psychology had reached levels that surpassed mainstream scientific knowledge by decades. They had developed techniques for predicting and manipulating individual behavior that were so sophisticated they seemed almost supernatural. Their agents could identify potential recruits, assess their psychological vulnerabilities, and develop customized approaches for winning their loyalty with remarkable accuracy. This psychological expertise had been refined through 2 centuries of experimentation and practical application. The families had learned from every success and failure, constantly improving their methods and adapting them to changing social conditions. Their techniques represented the accumulated wisdom of generations of practitioners who had dedicated their lives to understanding and manipulating human consciousness. The investigation revealed that the families had maintained detailed records of their psychological research throughout their history. These records, when finally recovered and analyzed, provided insights into human behavior that were revolutionary in their implications. The families had documented techniques for memory modification, personality alteration, and behavioral control that were decades ahead of anything in mainstream psychology. But the family's psychological expertise came with a terrible cost. Their research had been conducted on unwilling subjects who had suffered unimaginable trauma and abuse. The techniques they had developed were based on systematic violations of human dignity and autonomy that had been conducted over multiple generations. Their knowledge was built on a foundation of human suffering that would have horrified anyone who understood its true nature. The moral implications of the family's research posed difficult questions for investigators and government officials. The techniques they had developed were undeniably effective and potentially valuable for legitimate therapeutic and research purposes, but using knowledge that had been gained through systematic human rights violations would have been ethically indefensible, regardless of the potential benefits. The family's urban expansion had created a situation where their illegitimately gained knowledge was being applied in legitimate contexts by people who had no understanding of its true origins. Medical professionals were using therapeutic techniques that had been developed through torture and abuse. Educational administrators were implementing psychological methods that had been refined through decades of experimentation on kidnapped children. Law enforcement officers were being trained in behavioral control techniques that had been designed to suppress resistance and maintain absolute obedience. The challenge for investigators was developing strategies to counter the family's influence without destroying the beneficial applications of their research. Many of the techniques they had developed were genuinely useful for helping people overcome trauma, improve their mental health, and achieve their personal goals. The problem wasn't the techniques themselves, it was the way they were being used to serve the family's hidden agenda. The solution required a careful balance between protecting society from the family's influence and preserving the legitimate benefits of their research. Federal agencies worked with academic institutions and professional organizations to develop ethical guidelines for the use of psychological techniques that had been derived from the family's work. These guidelines were designed to prevent the misuse of powerful psychological methods while allowing their beneficial applications to continue. The family's response to increased scrutiny of their urban operations was characteristically sophisticated and adaptive. Rather than abandoning their expansion strategy, they modified their approach to make it even more difficult to detect and counter. They began recruiting agents through multiple layers of intermediaries, making it nearly impossible to trace the connection back to the families themselves. They developed new conditioning techniques that were even more subtle and resistant to detection. Most significantly, the families began to diversify their operations beyond their traditional focus on psychological manipulation. They started establishing networks in fields such as biotechnology, information technology, and financial services. These new ventures allowed them to accumulate resources and influence that could be used to support their primary activities while providing additional layers of protection against government interference. The biotechnology operations were particularly concerning because they gave the families access to cutting-edge research in genetics and neuroscience. Their agents in pharmaceutical companies and research institutions were positioned to influence the development of new drugs and treatments that could potentially be used for psychological manipulation. The family's traditional expertise in memory modification and behavioral control could be enhanced with modern pharmacological and genetic techniques to create even more powerful methods of human control. Though information technology operations provided the families with unprecedented capabilities for surveillance and social manipulation, their agents and technology companies had access to vast amounts of personal data that could be used to identify potential recruits and develop customized approaches for their conditioning. They could monitor communications, track behavioral patterns, and predict individual actions with remarkable accuracy. The financial services operations gave the families access to the economic systems that controlled resource distribution and wealth accumulation. Their agents in banks and investment firms could manipulate financial markets, control access to credit, and influence economic policy in ways that served the family's interests. They could reward their allies with favorable financial treatment while punishing their enemies with economic pressure. The integration of these diverse operations created a network of influence that was far more powerful than the sum of its parts. The families could use their psychological expertise to recruit agents, their biotechnology capabilities to enhance their conditioning techniques, their information technology resources to monitor and manipulate their targets, and their financial influence to reward loyalty and punish resistance. The scope of this integrated network posed challenges that were beyond the capabilities of traditional law enforcement approaches. The families had created a system that operated through legitimate channels while serving illegitimate purposes. Their activities were distributed across multiple sectors and jurisdictions, making it difficult to develop comprehensive strategies for countering their influence. The investigation revealed that the families had been planning this expansion for decades, carefully positioning themselves to take advantage of emerging technologies and social trends. They had anticipated the development of the internet, social media, and modern biotechnology, preparing their agents to exploit these new capabilities as they became available. Their strategic planning demonstrated a level of foresight and sophistication that was remarkable even by the standards of their previous achievements. The family's success in adapting to the modern world while maintaining their core identity and objectives represented a unique form of organizational evolution. They had managed to preserve their traditional knowledge and methods while incorporating new technologies and strategies that enhanced their effectiveness. They had created a hybrid organization that combined the best aspects of their historical approach with the advantages of modern capabilities. The investigation into the family's modern operations revealed that they had achieved something unprecedented in the history of human organization. They had created a network that could operate simultaneously in multiple dimensions: psychological, technological, financial, and political, while maintaining the secrecy and cohesion that had protected them for over 2 centuries. Their success represented a fundamental challenge to traditional understanding of how organizations could be structured and controlled. The families had proven that it was possible to maintain a hidden existence in the modern world while exercising significant influence over mainstream society. Their methods could potentially be replicated by other groups with similar objectives, creating the possibility of multiple hidden networks operating within American society. The implications for democratic governance and individual freedom were profound and disturbing. The realization that the families had successfully adapted to the modern world while maintaining their criminal activities forced a fundamental reassessment of national security priorities. The threat they posed was not just to individual victims, but to the basic principles of democratic society. Their ability to manipulate public opinion, control information flow, and influence policy decisions represented a form of warfare that was virtually invisible to its targets. The families had achieved their greatest victory not through direct confrontation, but through patient infiltration and gradual transformation of the systems they sought to control. They had learned to use democracy itself as a weapon, turning the openness and freedom of American society into vulnerabilities that could be exploited for their own purposes. Their success represented a new form of conquest that was far more effective than traditional military or political methods. The investigation revealed that the family's ultimate objective was not simply to survive or even to prosper. It was to transform American society into a system that would naturally support and protect their way of life. They were working to create a world where their methods would be not just tolerated, but celebrated as advanced forms of human development and social organization. Their vision was a society where psychological manipulation would be accepted as normal, where individual autonomy would be subordinated to collective efficiency, and where their expertise would be recognized as essential for human progress. This long-term vision explained the family's willingness to invest decades or even centuries in achieving their objectives. They weren't seeking immediate gratification or short-term gains. They were working toward a fundamental transformation of human civilization that would secure their position for generations to come. Their patience and persistence had already achieved remarkable results, and their continued progress suggested that their ultimate goals might eventually be realized. The family's success in adapting to the modern world while maintaining their essential character represented a profound challenge to the assumptions that underlay American democracy and individual freedom. They had proven that it was possible to subvert democratic institutions from within, to manipulate public opinion without detection, and to exercise control over individual behavior without consent. Their methods represented a form of soft totalitarianism that was potentially more dangerous than traditional forms of authoritarian control because it was invisible to its victims. The investigation into the family's modern operations had revealed a threat that was unprecedented in its scope and sophistication. The families had created a network that could operate simultaneously in multiple dimensions while maintaining the secrecy and cohesion that had protected them for over 2 centuries. Their success represented a fundamental challenge to traditional understanding of how democratic societies could be protected from internal subversion. The families had achieved something that no previous criminal organization had ever accomplished. They had learned to use the very freedoms and institutions of democratic society as tools for their own advancement. They had turned the openness of American society into a vulnerability, the diversity of American institutions into a camouflage, and the complexity of American government into a shield against detection and prosecution. But perhaps most disturbing of all, the families had demonstrated that their methods could be successfully applied on a scale that threatened the basic foundations of American civilization. Their network had grown from a handful of isolated mountain families into a sophisticated organization that could influence every aspect of American life. Their success suggested that the traditional safeguards of democratic society were inadequate to protect against this new form of internal threat. The investigation had revealed that the families represented more than just a criminal organization. They were a fundamental challenge to the assumptions that underlay modern democratic society. Their existence proved that it was possible to maintain a hidden system of control within an open democracy, to exercise power without accountability, and to influence the course of human events from the shadows of legitimate institutions. The family's greatest achievement wasn't their survival or even their expansion. It was their transformation of American society itself. They had managed to embed their methods so deeply into mainstream institutions that distinguishing between their influence and natural social evolution had become virtually impossible. The psychological techniques they had developed in remote mountain hollows were now being taught in universities, applied in hospitals, and used by government agencies around the world. Dr. Michael Harrison, a neuroscientist who had spent 15 years studying the family's research methodologies, described their impact in a classified report that was never made public. What we're witnessing isn't just the survival of a criminal organization, he wrote. It's the successful integration of systematically developed human control techniques into the fabric of modern society. The families haven't just adapted to our world, they've begun to remake it in their own image. The evidence supporting Harrison's assessment was overwhelming. Educational curricula across the country had been modified to include psychological conditioning techniques that bore unmistakable resemblances to methods developed by the families. Medical treatment protocols now routinely employed memory modification procedures that had been refined through decades of illegal experimentation. Corporate training programs utilized behavioral control methods that had originally been designed to create absolute obedience in kidnapped victims. The family's influence extended beyond specific techniques to encompass entire philosophical frameworks about human nature and social organization. Their core belief that individual autonomy was an illusion that could be overcome through proper conditioning had become increasingly mainstream in academic psychology, corporate management theory, and government policy development. The idea that human behavior could be optimized through systematic manipulation was no longer considered radical. It was becoming accepted wisdom. This philosophical transformation represented the family's most significant victory. They had succeeded in convincing mainstream society to voluntarily adopt worldviews that justified and enabled their methods. People who would have been horrified by the family's historical activities were now advocating for policies and practices that served the same ultimate purposes. The families had achieved ideological conquest without their victims even realizing they had been defeated. The process of ideological transformation had been so gradual and subtle that even trained investigators struggled to identify its boundaries. The families had learned to present their ideas in ways that seemed to be natural extensions of existing social trends. They had framed their methods as solutions to genuine problems, their techniques as improvements on traditional approaches, and their objectives as advancement of human welfare. The family's success in achieving ideological influence revealed the true sophistication of their long-term strategy. They had understood that lasting change required more than simple control of individuals or institutions. It required transformation of the underlying beliefs and values that shaped social behavior. By changing how people thought about human nature, individual rights, and social organization, they had created conditions where their methods would be naturally accepted and their objectives automatically pursued. The investigation revealed that the families had been working toward this ideological transformation for over a century, carefully seeding their ideas into academic discourse, professional training, and popular culture. Their agents had authored influential books, published groundbreaking research, and developed innovative programs that had shaped how entire generations of Americans thought about psychology, education, and social organization. The cumulative effect of this ideological campaign was a society that had become increasingly receptive to the family's methods and objectives. Americans had been conditioned to accept psychological manipulation as normal, to view individual autonomy as selfish, and to embrace collective efficiency as a moral imperative. The families had successfully transformed the cultural landscape in ways that made their activities appear not just acceptable, but desirable. The family's ideological victory was particularly evident in the field of education, where their influence had been most systematic and pervasive. Educational philosophy had evolved to emphasize psychological conditioning over academic achievement, social adjustment over individual development, and collective harmony over personal freedom. Students were being taught to monitor and modify their own thought patterns, to report on their classmates' behavior, and to accept authority without question. The transformation of educational priorities represented a fundamental shift in how American societies approached human development. The family's belief that individual consciousness could be shaped and controlled had become the foundation for educational practices that were being implemented in schools across the country. Children were being systematically conditioned to accept the very methods that the families had historically used to control their victims. The medical field had undergone similar transformation, with the family's techniques being integrated into standard treatment protocols for psychological disorders. Patients seeking help for trauma, depression, or anxiety were being subjected to memory modification procedures that had been developed through illegal experimentation. The treatments were presented as cutting-edge therapeutic approaches, but they were actually refined versions of techniques that had been used to transform kidnapped victims into loyal family agents. The integration of the family's methods into mainstream medicine represented a particularly insidious form of conquest. Patients who sought help for their psychological suffering were being exposed to the very techniques that had created such suffering in the first place. The families had achieved the ultimate perversion. They had convinced society to voluntarily submit to their methods under the guise of healing and self-improvement. The law enforcement community had not been immune to the family's influence. Police departments across the country had adopted training programs that emphasized psychological manipulation over traditional investigative techniques. Officers were being taught to use behavioral control methods that had been designed to suppress resistance and maintain absolute compliance. The techniques were presented as progressive alternatives to physical force, but they were actually sophisticated forms of psychological coercion. The transformation of law enforcement practices represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between citizens and government. The family's methods had been integrated into the basic functions of social control, creating a system where individual rights could be systematically violated without obvious signs of abuse. Citizens were being conditioned to accept psychological manipulation as normal police procedure, gradually eroding the constitutional protections that had historically limited government power. The family's influence on corporate culture had been equally profound. Business training programs now routinely employed psychological conditioning techniques that had been developed for controlling unwilling subjects. Employees were being taught to monitor their own thoughts and behaviors, to report on their colleagues' activities, and to accept corporate authority without question. The workplace had become a laboratory for the family's methods, with millions of Americans being subjected to systematic psychological manipulation disguised as professional development. The transformation of corporate culture represented a new form of economic control that went far beyond traditional employer-employee relationships. The families had learned to use psychological conditioning to create workers who were not just compliant, but enthusiastic about their subjugation. Employees would genuinely believe they were benefiting from training programs that were actually designed to suppress their individual autonomy and critical thinking abilities. The family's success in transforming American institutions had created a society where their methods were not just tolerated, but celebrated. Universities were teaching their techniques as advanced forms of human development. Hospitals were applying their procedures as cutting-edge medical treatments. Corporations were implementing their systems as innovative management strategies. Government agencies were utilizing their approaches as progressive policy tools. The scope of this institutional transformation revealed the true extent of the family's victory. They had succeeded in embedding their methods so deeply into American society that removing them would require dismantling the entire social structure. Their techniques had become so integral to how institutions operated that eliminating them would cause massive disruption to essential services and social functions. The families had achieved something unprecedented in human history. They had successfully transformed an entire civilization while remaining completely hidden from public view. Their victory was so complete that most Americans had no idea they were living in a society that had been systematically modified to serve the interests of hidden masters who had originated in remote mountain hollows over 2 centuries ago. The investigation into the family's modern operations had revealed a threat that was fundamentally different from any previous challenge to American democracy. Traditional enemies had sought to destroy or conquer American institutions through direct confrontation. The families had achieved the same result through patient infiltration and gradual transformation, turning America's greatest strengths into vulnerabilities that could be exploited for their own purposes. The family's success represented more than just a criminal conspiracy. It was a fundamental challenge to the assumptions that underlay modern civilization. They had proven that it was possible to maintain absolute control over human behavior while convincing the subjects of that control that they were free. They had demonstrated that democratic institutions could be subverted from within while maintaining the appearance of legitimate governance. They had shown that individual autonomy could be systematically destroyed while making people grateful for their subjugation. The implications of the family's victory extended far beyond the borders of the United States. Their methods were being exported to other countries through international academic exchanges, corporate partnerships, and government cooperation programs. The techniques that had been developed in Appalachian hollows were now being applied in schools, hospitals, and government agencies around the world. The families had achieved global influence without ever revealing their existence to the vast majority of their victims. The investigation had revealed that the families represented a new form of power that was uniquely suited to the modern world. They had learned to exercise control through influence rather than force, to achieve compliance through conditioning rather than coercion, and to maintain authority through manipulation rather than intimidation. Their methods were so sophisticated that their victims would defend the very systems that oppressed them. The family's greatest achievement was not their survival or even their expansion. It was their transformation of human consciousness itself. They had succeeded in changing how people thought about freedom, autonomy, and individual rights. They had convinced entire generations that psychological manipulation was normal, that individual privacy was selfish, and that collective efficiency was more important than personal liberty. The evidence was overwhelming, the implications were terrifying, and the scope of the threat was unprecedented. The families had achieved a form of conquest that was more complete and more permanent than any military victory in human history. They had not just conquered territory or defeated armies, they had conquered the human mind itself, turning the very capacity for independent thought into a tool for their own advancement. As this investigation draws to a close, one question remains. What can be done to counter a threat that has already achieved such complete victory? The families have demonstrated that traditional approaches to law enforcement and national security are inadequate to address their methods. They have shown that democratic institutions can be subverted from within, that individual rights can be systematically violated without detection, and that entire civilizations can be transformed while their citizens remain unaware of what is happening to them. The answer may lie not in confronting the families directly, but in understanding the deeper implications of their success. They have revealed fundamental vulnerabilities in human nature and social organization that extend far beyond their particular case. Their methods could potentially be used by other groups with different objectives, creating the possibility of multiple hidden networks operating within modern society. The family's story serves as a warning about the fragility of human freedom and the ease with which it can be systematically destroyed. Their success demonstrates that eternal vigilance is not just the price of liberty, it is the minimum requirement for maintaining human dignity in a world where the technology of control has advanced far beyond the safeguards that were designed to protect individual rights. The Appalachian families that nobody dares to mention have achieved their ultimate victory not through the dramatic confrontations of popular imagination, but through the patient application of psychological techniques that have transformed the very nature of human consciousness. Their legacy is not just the survival of a criminal organization, but the creation of a new form of civilization where freedom is an illusion and individual autonomy is a carefully managed fantasy. The investigation is complete, but the threat continues. The families remain hidden in plain sight, their methods embedded in the institutions that shape our daily lives, their influence extending into every aspect of modern society. They have proven that the most dangerous enemies of human freedom are not those who attack it directly, but those who convince us to surrender it voluntarily while believing we are advancing toward a better world. The story of the Appalachian families is ultimately a story about the price of ignorance and the power of hidden knowledge. It reminds us that the greatest threats to human freedom often come from those who claim to be working for our benefit, and that the most effective forms of control are those that convince their victims to participate willingly in their own subjugation. In the end, the families have achieved something that no tyrant in history ever managed. They have created a system of control that is maintained by its victims, defended by those it oppresses, and celebrated by the very people it destroys. Their victory is complete. Their methods are embedded in the fabric of modern society, and their influence continues to grow with each passing day. The question that remains is whether humanity will recognize what has been done to it before it is too late to reclaim the freedom that has been so skillfully and systematically taken away. The families have shown us the future they are creating, a world where individual consciousness is a managed resource, where human behavior is optimized for collective efficiency, and where the very concept of personal autonomy becomes a historical curiosity from a more primitive age. This is the legacy of the Appalachian families that nobody dares to mention, not because they are too dangerous to confront, but because they have already won.